The evening sun was setting over Oak Ridge when Sergeant David Thompson pulled into his sister's driveway. He had just finished a long drive from the Army base, still wearing his dress uniform from an award ceremony earlier that day. The bronze star on his chest caught the last rays of sunlight as he stepped out of his car. David stretched his tired muscles and smiled. He hadn't seen his sister Lisa in 6 months, not since before his deployment to overseas. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a quiet family dinner to mark his safe return home. He grabbed the flowers he'd bought for Lisa from the passenger seat and walked toward the house, but Lisa wasn't home yet. Her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, waved from across the street and called out that Lisa was running late from work. David decided to drive around the neighborhood for a bit, maybe grab some coffee while he waited. He'd always loved this quiet suburban area with its tree-lined streets and well-kept houses. As David drove slowly down Maple Street, he noticed a police car in his rearview mirror. Officer Ryan Blake had been patrolling this area for 3 years. Blake was known among his colleagues for being tough on crime. Though some whispered he was too quick to see trouble where none existed, Blake noticed the expensive car driving slowly through the neighborhood. In his mind, something didn't feel right. A young black man in a nice car, driving slowly, looking around. Blake's instincts told him to investigate. He flipped on his lights and pulled the car over. David's heart sank when he saw the flashing lights. He'd been pulled over before, and he knew the drill. Stay calm, keep your hands visible, be respectful. He pulled over carefully and turned off the engine. Placing both hands on the steering wheel where the officer could see them, Blake approached the driver's side window with his hand resting on his weapon. This was standard procedure, he told himself, though his pulse was already quickening. When David rolled down the window, Blake immediately noticed the military uniform. "License and registration," Blake said curtly, his eyes scanning the car's interior. "Yes, sir," David replied calmly. "I'm reaching for my wallet now." He moved slowly and deliberately, making sure the officer could see every movement. Blake looked at the license. David Thompson, age 28, local address. But something still bothered him about the situation. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked. "I'm visiting my sister, sir. She lives on this street." David kept his voice steady and polite despite feeling frustrated. He'd done nothing wrong, and yet here he was being questioned like a criminal. "Your sister?" Blake's tone suggested. He didn't believe it. "What's her address?" David gave him Lisa's address, which was just 2 blocks away. Blake wrote it down but didn't seem satisfied. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. "Sir, may I ask why I'm being asked to step out? I haven't done anything wrong." Blake's frustration was growing. He didn't like being questioned, especially by someone he'd pulled over. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now?" David knew he had rights, but he also knew that challenging a police officer during a stop could make things worse. He slowly opened the door and stepped out, his hands still visible. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, and he drew on that training now. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," Blake commanded as David complied. Blake began patting him down. "What's this?" Blake asked, feeling something in David's jacket pocket. "It's my military ID, sir, and some papers from the base." Blake reached into the pocket and pulled out David's military identification card along with some official-looking documents. The ID clearly showed David's rank and photo, confirming he was indeed an Army sergeant. But instead of calming Blake down, this seemed to agitate him more. "So you're military," Blake said with a sneer. "Think that makes you special?" David was shocked by the officer's attitude. In his experience, most people respected military service. "No, sir, I just want you to know who I am." Blake looked at the documents David had been carrying. They were routine military papers, but he couldn't read the technical language. In his suspicious mind, they looked secretive and important. "What are these papers, some kind of classified stuff?" "No, sir, they're just routine paperwork from the base. Training, schedules and equipment logs." But Blake wasn't convinced. His imagination was running wild now. A black man in an expensive car, driving slowly through a nice neighborhood, carrying official-looking military documents. It all seemed suspicious to him. Other cars were starting to drive by, and some neighbors had come out of their houses to see what was happening. Blake felt the pressure of being watched, which only made him more nervous and aggressive. "I don't believe you," Blake said finally. "I think you're up to something." David felt his heart racing, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Sir, you can call the base to verify my identity. My commanding officer can confirm everything." Blake laughed bitterly. "Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job?" The situation was spiraling out of control, and David could feel it. What had started as a simple traffic stop was becoming something much more dangerous. He could see the anger in Blake's eyes, could hear the hostility in his voice. Mrs. Rodriguez, from across the street, had recognized David and was now watching from her porch, her phone in her hand. She'd known Lisa's family for years and had met David before. Something about this stop didn't feel right to her. Blake noticed the growing audience and felt even more pressure to maintain control of the situation. In his mind, he was the authority here, and this man was challenging that authority. "I'm going to need you to explain exactly what you're doing here," Blake said, his voice getting louder. David took a deep breath. "Sir, as I explained, I'm visiting my sister Lisa Thompson. She lives at 1247 Maple Street. I just returned from military deployment and wanted to see her." "Prove it," Blake demanded. "How would you like me to prove it, sir?" Blake was getting more frustrated by the minute. He felt like David was being too calm, too polite. It seemed fake to him. In his experience, guilty people often acted overly cooperative to hide their crimes. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. What should have been a quick interaction was turning into a confrontation that neither man had wanted, but both were now trapped in. David just wanted to see his sister. Blake just wanted to do his job. But somehow, in this moment on this quiet street, their two worlds were about to collide in a way that would change everything. The evening air felt heavy as the confrontation continued to build. Officer Blake's radio crackled with routine dispatch calls, but his full attention was focused on David. The sergeant stood by his car, hands visible, trying to understand why a simple visit to his sister had turned into this tense situation. "I want to see more identification," Blake demanded, his voice growing sharper. "Something that proves you live around here." David felt confused. He'd already shown his driver's license and military ID. "Sir, I showed you my license with my address, and my military identification confirms who I am." Blake shook his head. "That's not enough. I want to see something else." Several more neighbors had come outside now. The commotion was drawing attention. On what was usually a peaceful street, Mrs. Rodriguez was still watching from her porch, and she'd quietly started recording with her phone. Something about this whole situation felt wrong to her. "Sir, what exactly are you looking for?" David asked, trying to keep his voice respectful despite his growing frustration. Blake's patience was running thin. In his mind, David was being difficult and uncooperative. "Don't question me. Just do what I tell you to do." David reached slowly toward his jacket pocket. "I have some mail in my car with my sister's address on it. Would that help?" "Stop right there," Blake shouted suddenly, his hand moving to his weapon. "What are you reaching for?" David immediately froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. "I was just reaching for the mail you asked about, sir." But Blake was already caught up in his own fear and adrenaline. In his mind, David's movement looked threatening. All his training about split-second decisions and officer safety was flooding through his thoughts. "Keep your hands where I can." "See them," Blake yelled, now drawing his weapon. David's military training kicked in. He slowly raised both hands above his head, palms open and visible. "Sir, I'm not reaching for anything threatening. I was just trying to get the mail you requested." Mrs. Rodriguez gasped from her porch as she saw the officer draw his gun. She held her phone steadier, making sure she was capturing everything. Her heart was pounding as she watched this terrifying scene unfold. "Sir, please," David said calmly, his hands still raised. "I'm a decorated Army sergeant. I'm not a threat to you or anyone else." But Blake was beyond reason now. The stress of the situation, his preconceived notions, and his own fears had created a perfect storm. I said, "Don't move." David hadn't moved. He stood perfectly still with his hands raised, but Blake was seeing threats that weren't there. Other neighbors were now coming out of their houses, drawn by the shouting. Someone else had started recording with their phone. "Officer, please." David tried again. "Let me show you my military orders. They'll prove everything I've told you." Blake interpreted this as another attempt to reach for something. "I told you not to reach for anything." The situation had spiraled completely out of control. What Blake saw as a dangerous suspect ignoring commands, David experienced as a confusing nightmare where nothing he did seemed right. "Sir, I haven't reached for anything," David said, his voice still calm despite the terror he was feeling. "My hands have been raised the entire time." Blake was shaking now, his weapon pointed at David. Years of training about officer safety and split-second decisions were overwhelming his ability to think clearly. In his panic state, he convinced himself that David was about to make a threatening move. Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't stay silent anymore. "Officer, he's just visiting his." "Sister," she called out from her porch, "I know this young man." Blake spun around briefly, angry at the interference. "Ma'am, get back inside your house." In that moment of distraction, David made a slight movement to steady himself. It was nothing more than shifting his weight from one foot to the other, but Blake whipped back around and saw it as aggression. "I warned you!" Blake screamed. David saw the officer's finger tighten on the trigger and felt pure terror. "Please don't shoot, I haven't done anything wrong." But Blake was beyond hearing reason. In his mind, he was in mortal danger from this man who had supposedly defied his commands. All his fears and prejudices came together in this moment of panic. The shots rang out like thunder in the quiet neighborhood. 3 quick pops that shattered the evening calm. David felt the impact and stumbled backward, his hands clutching his chest as he fell to the ground. Mrs. Rodriguez screamed from her porch, dropping her phone but somehow managing to keep recording. Other neighbors rushed toward the scene, shouting for someone to call an ambulance. Blake stood over David's motionless form, his weapon still drawn, breathing heavily. The reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in, but his training told him to secure the scene first and think later. David lay on the asphalt, his dress uniform torn and bloodied. The bronze star on his chest was now stained red. He was conscious but struggling to breathe, looking up at the darkening sky and wondering how a visit to his sister had ended like this. "Stay down," Blake shouted, though David clearly wasn't going anywhere. The neighbors who had rushed forward stopped abruptly. When they saw Blake still had his weapon drawn, Mrs. Rodriguez was crying and calling 911 from her porch, her voice shaking as she tried to explain to the dispatcher what she had witnessed. Within minutes, the quiet street was filled with the sound of sirens. Ambulances, fire trucks, and more police cars were racing toward the scene. Blake finally holstered his weapon and got on his radio to report an officer-involved shooting. As the paramedics worked frantically to save David's life, Blake began constructing his version of events in his mind. He would say that the suspect had been acting suspiciously, had failed to follow commands, and had made threatening movements that forced him to defend himself, but he hadn't counted on the witnesses. He hadn't noticed Mrs. Rodriguez recording from her porch or the other neighbors who had their phones out. He hadn't realized that his own body camera had captured every word of the confrontation. David was loaded into an ambulance, fighting for his life. The paramedics worked desperately to stop the bleeding and stabilize him for the trip to the hospital. As the ambulance pulled away with its lights flashing and sirens wailing, Blake stood in the middle of the street surrounded by crime scene. Tape and questioning looks from his fellow officers. The quiet neighborhood would never be the same. And neither would the lives of everyone involved in those terrible few minutes when fear and prejudice overcame reason and justice. The crime scene was chaos. Red and blue lights painted the quiet neighborhood in harsh colors as police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks filled the street. Officer Blake stood near his patrol car, trying to calm his shaking hands as his supervisor Captain Martinez arrived on the scene. Captain Martinez had been a police officer for 22 years. He'd seen officer-involved shootings before, and he knew how quickly these situations could spiral out of control if not handled properly. His first priority was always protecting his officers and the department. "What happened here, Blake?" Martinez asked, pulling him aside from the growing crowd of investigators and witnesses. Blake took a deep breath, his story already forming in his mind. "I pulled over a suspicious vehicle. The driver was acting nervous and evasive. When I asked for additional identification, he became aggressive and reached for something in his jacket. I feared for my safety and had to defend myself." Martinez nodded, making mental notes. It sounded like a reasonable account, but he needed to see all the evidence before making any decisions. "Where's your body camera footage?" Blake's heart skipped a beat. He'd forgotten about the body camera in all the chaos. "It should have recorded everything, sir." Martinez called over the evidence technician. "I need to review the body camera footage immediately, and I want statements from all witnesses, secured before anyone leaves." While Martinez was reviewing the footage in his patrol car, the neighborhood was buzzing with activity. Mrs. Rodriguez was still on her porch, talking to a detective about what she had witnessed. Her hands were shaking as she showed him the video. On her phone, "Officer, that young man never threatened anyone," she said firmly. "He was polite and respectful the whole time. He had his hands up when he was shot." The detective took notes but didn't comment on her statement. Other neighbors were giving similar accounts to different officers. A pattern was emerging that didn't match Blake's initial story. At the hospital, David was in emergency surgery. The bullets had caused serious damage, and doctors were working frantically to save his life. His sister Lisa had arrived and was pacing the waiting room, demanding answers that no one could give her yet. "How did this happen?" she kept asking. "He was just coming to visit me. He's a decorated soldier. This doesn't make sense." Back at the scene, Captain Martinez finished reviewing the body camera footage. His face was grim as he realized what he was dealing with. The video clearly showed David with his hands raised, speaking respectfully to Blake. There was no threatening movement, no aggressive behavior. Just a scared man trying to comply with increasingly hostile commands. Martinez knew this was bad. Very bad. The kind of bad that could destroy careers and cost the city millions in lawsuits. The kind of bad that made national news and sparked protests. He needed to control this situation quickly. He called Blake back to his car. "We need to talk privately." They drove a few blocks away from the scene to have a conversation away from witnesses and cameras. Martinez chose his words carefully. "Blake, I've reviewed your body camera footage. The situation ... it's complicated." Blake felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean, sir?" "The footage doesn't completely support your initial statement. We need to think about how to handle this properly." Blake realized his career was on the line. "Captain, I felt threatened. The suspect wasn't following my commands." Martinez held up his hand. "I understand you felt threatened, but we need to make sure our reports accurately reflect what happened. The media is going to be all over this, especially since the victim is military." They spent the next hour crafting a revised statement that would put Blake's actions in the best possible light. They emphasized David's suspicious behavior and failure to comply, while downplaying the clear evidence that he had been cooperative and non-threatening. Meanwhile, back at the scene, the witnesses were becoming increasingly frustrated with the police response. Mrs. Rodriguez and several neighbors felt like their statements weren't being taken seriously. "They're not listening to us," Mrs. Rodriguez told her neighbor. "We all saw the same thing. That officer shot an innocent man." Word was already spreading through social media. Someone had posted a short video clip online and it was being shared rapidly. The hashtag Justice for David was starting to trend. At the military base where David was stationed, his commanding officer, Colonel Harris, was receiving urgent phone calls about the incident. The Army took attacks on their personnel very seriously, especially when those personnel were decorated veterans with security clearances. Colonel Harris immediately contacted the Pentagon to report the incident. Within hours, military intelligence officers were being briefed on the situation. They were particularly concerned when they learned that David had been carrying routine military documents at the time of the shooting, back at the hospital. David was out of surgery but in critical condition. Lisa sat by his bedside, holding his hand and praying for his recovery. She had contacted a civil rights lawyer who was already asking tough questions about the shooting. Captain Martinez was working overtime to control the narrative. He held a brief press conference describing the incident as a routine traffic stop that escalated when the suspect failed to comply with lawful orders. But the witnesses weren't staying quiet. Mrs. Rodriguez had contacted local news stations and civil rights organizations. Her video was being analyzed by experts who pointed out the clear discrepancies between the police account and what actually happened. The police union had also gotten involved, providing Blake with a lawyer and issuing statements supporting his actions. They claimed he had followed proper procedures and had acted in self-defense. However, the body camera footage was becoming a problem they couldn't solve. Despite their attempts to frame the narrative, the video clearly showed what had really happened. Blake's lawyer advised him to prepare for the possibility of criminal charges. As the night wore on, protests began forming outside the police station. Community leaders and civil rights activists were demanding justice for David and accountability for Blake. The cover-up was starting to unravel before it had even fully begun. Too many people had seen what really happened. Too much evidence existed. And most importantly, the federal government was starting to take notice. Colonel Harris had already contacted the FBI to report the attack on military personnel. Military lawyers were reviewing the case and determining what federal laws might have been violated. The quiet suburban neighborhood where it all began was now the center of a growing storm that would soon reach the highest levels of government. The Pentagon was buzzing with activity at 3 a.m. General Rebecca Washington sat in her office, reviewing reports that had been flooding in since midnight. As the head of military personnel security, she took any attack on military personnel very seriously, but this case was different. This case was explosive. The initial report from Colonel Harris had been straightforward. Decorated Army sergeant shot by local police during a traffic stop. But as more details emerged, General Washington realized they were dealing with something much bigger than a simple case of police brutality. Her aide, Major Stevens, knocked on the door and entered with another stack of documents. "Ma'am, we've received the complete file on Sergeant Thompson. You need to see this immediately." General Washington opened the file and felt her blood pressure rise. David Thompson wasn't just any soldier. He was a highly decorated combat veteran with top secret security clearance. He had served in special operations and had access to classified information about ongoing military operations. "Tell me about the documents he was carrying," she said. Major Stevens consulted his notes. "Sir, the local police confiscated several papers from his person. While they appear to be routine training schedules to untrained eyes, 3 of those documents actually contain coded references to Operation Silent Thunder." General Washington's jaw tightened. Operation Silent Thunder was a classified military operation that only a handful of people in the entire country knew about. If those documents fell into the wrong hands, national security could be compromised. "Who has access to those documents now?" she asked. "Local police evidence room, ma'am. The arresting officer and his supervisor have both handled them." "Unknown. How many others may have seen them?" This was exactly the kind of nightmare scenario that kept military leaders awake at night. A decorated soldier with security clearance had been shot by local police, and classified documents were now sitting in a civilian evidence room where anyone could access them. General Washington picked up her secure phone and placed a call to the Secretary of Defense. Within minutes, she was connected to the highest levels of the Pentagon. "Sir, we have a code red situation involving compromised classified materials and an attack on military personnel," she began. The Secretary of Defense listened grimly as General Washington explained the full scope of the problem. This wasn't just about justice for one soldier anymore. This was about national security. I want a full military investigation launched immediately, the secretary ordered. And I want those documents secured. Use whatever federal resources necessary. General Washington assembled her team within the hour. Military investigators, intelligence analysts, and legal experts were all called in for an emergency briefing. The room was tense as she laid out the situation. Gentlemen and ladies, we have a decorated combat veteran fighting for his life in a hospital because a police officer shot him during what appears to be an unjustified traffic stop. But that's only the beginning of our problems. She clicked a remote, and David's military record appeared on the screen. Sergeant Thompson has top-secret clearance and was carrying classified documents when he was shot. Those documents are now in civilian hands, creating a potential security breach. Major Stevens stood up to brief the team on what they had learned about Officer Blake. Our preliminary investigation shows that Blake has a history of complaints for excessive force and racial bias. His department has tried to cover up previous incidents. Intelligence analyst Captain Johnson raised her hand. Ma'am, we've also discovered that Blake's brother-in-law works for a private security company that has contracts with foreign governments. The potential for intelligence compromise is significant. General Washington nodded grimly. That's exactly why we're taking control of this situation. I want a complete background check on every person who has had access to those documents. I want surveillance on Blake and his associates, and I want federal warrants prepared. The legal team had been working through the night to build a case for federal intervention. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks presented their findings. Ma'am, we have multiple federal crimes we can pursue: violation of civil rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, and potentially espionage depending on what we find about the document security breach. General Washington stood up and addressed the entire room. This is no longer just a local police matter. This is a federal case involving national security and an attack on military personnel. We have jurisdiction, and we're going to use it. She assigned specific tasks to each team member. Intelligence would continue investigating Blake and anyone who had contact with the documents. Legal would prepare federal warrants and coordinate with the FBI. Military police would work with federal agents to secure the evidence. I want everything ready for immediate action, she concluded. We're not going to let this incident be swept under the rug or covered up by local authorities. Meanwhile, at the hospital, David was slowly regaining consciousness. His sister Lisa was still by his bedside when Colonel Harris arrived to check on his condition. "How is he, doctor?" the colonel asked. "He's stable, but the injuries are severe. He'll survive, but he may have permanent disabilities." Colonel Harris felt anger building inside him. David was one of his best soldiers, a man who had served his country with honor and distinction. The idea that he had been shot down like a criminal while visiting his sister was infuriating. "Sergeant Thompson," the colonel said softly as David opened his eyes. David tried to speak but could only whisper, "Sir ... What happened? Why did he shoot me?" "Don't worry about that now, son. You focus on getting better. The Army is going to take care of everything else." Lisa looked at the colonel with hope in her eyes. "Are you going to get justice for my brother?" Colonel Harris met her gaze with determination. "Ma'am, I can promise you that the United States Army takes care of its own. This won't be swept under the rug." Back at the Pentagon, General Washington was receiving hourly updates on the investigation. Her team had discovered even more disturbing information about the local police department's handling of the case. "Ma'am," Major Stevens reported, "we have evidence that Captain Martinez instructed Blake to alter his statement. They're actively trying to cover up what really happened." General Washington felt her anger growing. Bad enough that one of her soldiers had been shot, but now local authorities were trying to cover it up and deny him justice. "That seals it," she said firmly. "Prepare the federal warrants. We're taking this case away from local authorities and prosecuting it ourselves." She picked up her phone and called the FBI director personally. "This is General Washington at the Pentagon. I need to speak with you about a case that requires immediate federal intervention." The wheels of federal justice were now in motion. What had started as a local police shooting was about to become a federal case with national implications. Officer Blake and his department had no idea what was coming their way. The military had decided to fight back, and they had resources and authority that local police could never match. Justice for David Thompson was no longer just a hope, it was becoming an inevitability. The federal courthouse in downtown was unusually busy for a Thursday morning. Judge Patricia Williams had been called in early to review an urgent warrant request that had come down from the highest levels of the Justice Department as she read through the documents. Her expression grew increasingly serious. FBI agent Robert Chun stood before the judge's bench, flanked by federal prosecutors and military liaisons. This wasn't a typical warrant request, and everyone in the room knew it. Your Honor, Agent Chun began, the United States government is requesting federal warrants for Officer Ryan Blake and Captain Martinez of the Oak Ridge Police Department on charges of civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Judge Williams had been on the federal bench for 15 years, but she had never seen a case move this quickly from incident to federal charges. Agent Chun, walk me through the evidence that justifies federal intervention. Agent Chun activated a large screen and began presenting the case. Your Honor, we have clear video evidence from multiple sources showing that Sergeant David Thompson, a decorated Army veteran, was shot without justification during a traffic stop. The victim was compliant, non-threatening, and had committed no crime. The judge watched the body camera footage and witness videos with growing dismay. The evidence was overwhelming and deeply disturbing. Furthermore, Agent Chun continued, we have recorded conversations between Officer Blake and Captain Martinez, showing a deliberate attempt to cover up the true facts of the incident and obstruct the investigation. Federal Prosecutor Lisa Park, step forward. Your Honor, this case meets every requirement for federal civil rights prosecution under Section 242 of Title 18. The defendants violated Sergeant Thompson's constitutional rights under color of law. Judge Williams reviewed the legal documents carefully. The case was solid, the evidence was clear, and federal jurisdiction was appropriate. I'm issuing the warrants, she announced. Execute them immediately. Outside the courthouse, a convoy of federal vehicles was already assembled. FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and military police had been coordinating for hours to ensure the arrests would go smoothly. General Washington had insisted on military representation to send a clear message that attacks on military personnel would not be tolerated. Agent Chun received the signed warrants and immediately radioed his teams. All units, warrants are signed and sealed, move to execute. The first team headed to Officer Blake's house in the suburbs. Blake was just finishing his morning coffee when he saw the convoy of black SUVs pulling into his driveway. His heart dropped as he realized what was happening. Blake's wife Jennifer looked out the window in shock. Ryan, what's going on? Why are there so many police cars here? Blake knew his world was about to collapse. I don't know, honey. Let me handle this. Agent Chun approached the front door with the warrant in hand, flanked by 6 other agents. His knock was firm and authoritative. Blake opened the door, already knowing what was coming. Ryan Blake, you're under arrest for violation of civil rights under color of law and obstruction of justice. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Blake's neighbors came out to watch the dramatic scene. News crews, alerted by federal sources, were already setting up cameras across the street. Blake's arrest was being broadcast live on every major news network. You have the right to remain silent, Agent Chun continued as Blake was led to a waiting vehicle. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Blake's wife was crying on the front porch as her husband was driven away. She had no idea how serious the charges were or how dramatically their lives were about to change. At the same time, another team was executing the warrant for Captain Martinez at the police station. Martinez was in his office when FBI agents walked through the front doors of the building, creating chaos among the officers. We have federal warrants, Agent Rodriguez announced to the desk sergeant. We need to see Captain Martinez immediately. The entire police station fell silent as federal agents walked through their building. Officers stood aside, unsure of what to do or say. This was unprecedented in the department's history. Martinez came out of his office, already knowing why they were there. The FBI had been investigating for days, and he had been expecting this moment. Captain Martinez, you're under arrest for conspiracy and obstruction of justice in connection with the civil rights violation of Sergeant David Thompson. As Martinez was handcuffed in front of his own officers, the symbolic impact was enormous. The federal government was sending a clear message that no one was above the law. Regardless of their position or authority, news of the arrest spread rapidly through social media and news networks. The hashtag Justice for David exploded across all platforms as people shared videos of the arrests and expressed support for federal intervention. At the hospital, David was watching the news coverage from his bed. His sister Lisa sat beside him, tears streaming down her face as she watched Blake being led away in handcuffs. "They actually did it," she whispered. "They're really going to get justice for you." David felt a mixture of relief and vindication. For days he had wondered if the system would protect the officers who had nearly killed him. Now he was seeing that there were people in positions of power who were willing to fight for what was right. Colonel Harris arrived at the hospital shortly after the arrests. "Sergeant, I wanted you to hear this directly from me." The Army kept its promise. Those officers are now in federal custody. David tried to speak, but his voice was still weak. "Thank you, sir." "I never expected this much support." "Son, the United States Army doesn't abandon its soldiers. What happened to you was an attack on all of us." Meanwhile, at the federal detention center, Blake was beginning to understand the full scope of what he was facing. His lawyer had arrived and was explaining the charges. "Ryan, these are serious federal charges. We're not talking about a department investigation or administrative leave. You could be looking at decades in prison." Blake felt panic rising in his chest. "But I was just doing my job. I felt threatened." His lawyer shook his head. "The evidence doesn't support that claim. The video footage shows clearly that Sergeant Thompson was not threatening you in any way." The news conferences began within hours. General Washington held a press briefing at the Pentagon, flanked by military leaders and federal prosecutors. "Today's arrests send a clear message," she announced to the assembled media. "The United States military will not tolerate attacks on our personnel, regardless of who commits them or what uniform they wear." FBI Director Collins held his own press conference, emphasizing the federal commitment to civil rights. "These arrests demonstrate that the federal government will use all available resources to prosecute civil rights violations and ensure equal justice under law." The contrast between the swift federal action and the local department's attempted cover-up was striking. Within 72 hours of the shooting, federal authorities had investigated, gathered evidence, obtained warrants, and executed arrests. Community leaders who had been demanding justice were amazed at the speed and thoroughness of the federal response. Reverend Johnson, who had organized protests outside the police station, told reporters, "We've never seen justice move this quickly. The federal government has shown what accountability looks like, but the arrests were only the beginning." Federal prosecutors were already preparing for trial, building a case that would expose not just the individual crimes, but the systemic problems that had made them possible. The message was clear. When local authorities failed to provide justice, the federal government would step in to ensure that civil rights were protected and military personnel were defended. Officer Blake and Captain Martinez were learning that their actions had consequences far beyond what they had ever imagined. The full weight of federal justice was now bearing down on them. The federal detention center was unlike anything Blake had ever experienced. Gone were the familiar surroundings of his local police station, replaced by the cold efficiency of federal law enforcement. As he sat in the interrogation room, still wearing the clothes he'd been arrested in, Blake realized his life had changed forever. Agent Chun entered the room carrying a thick file and a laptop computer. He was accompanied by federal prosecutor Lisa Park and, surprisingly, a military officer Blake didn't recognize. The presence of the military representative made Blake's stomach clench with anxiety. "Mr. Blake," Agent Chun began formally, "I want to make sure you understand the serious nature of the charges against you. Blake's lawyer, Thomas Wright, leaned forward. My client understands he's been charged, but we question the federal government's jurisdiction in this matter. Prosecutor Park smiled grimly. Mr. Wright, your client shot a decorated military veteran who was carrying classified documents. Federal jurisdiction is absolutely clear here. Blake felt the blood drain from his face. Classified documents? What are you talking about? Agent Chun opened his laptop and turned it toward Blake. Sergeant Thompson was carrying routine military paperwork that contained coded references to classified operations. When you shot him and those documents entered civilian evidence storage, you created a potential national security breach. The military officer, Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, spoke for the first time. Mr. Blake, do you understand that your actions may have compromised ongoing military operations? Blake was stunned. He had no idea that the papers he'd seen in David's jacket were anything other than routine military forms. I didn't know they were classified. They looked like normal paperwork to me. That's exactly the problem, Agent Chun said. You had no training or clearance to handle those documents, yet your actions put them at risk. Prosecutor Park opened her file and spread photographs across the table. Mr. Blake, we have extensive evidence of your pattern of misconduct. This isn't an isolated incident. The photograph showed complaint forms, internal affairs reports, and witness statements spanning Blake's entire career. Blake recognized some of the incidents but had thought they were buried in department files. 3 excessive force complaints. In 2 years, Agent Chun read from the file. 5 complaints of racial bias. 2 incidents where you were reprimanded for inappropriate use of authority. Blake's lawyer looked disturbed as he reviewed the evidence. He hadn't known about the extent of his client's history when he took the case. Your department has been covering for you for years, Prosecutor Park continued. But they can't cover for you anymore. Agent Chun activated a recording device. Mr. Blake, I'm going to play some conversations that were recorded during the investigation. The room filled with the sound of Blake's voice talking to Captain Martinez after the shooting. Blake heard himself helping to craft a false narrative about the incident, minimizing his actions and exaggerating the threat David had posed. We need to stick to the story, Blake's recorded voice said. He was acting suspicious and failed to comply with my commands. Blake watched his lawyer's face grow more concerned with each word. The recorded evidence of conspiracy and obstruction was damning. Mr. Blake, Lieutenant Colonel Brooks said seriously, do you understand that you shot an American hero? Sergeant Thompson has been decorated for valor in combat. He has saved American lives in service to his country. Agent Chin pulled out David's military record and placed it on the table. Bronze Star for valor. Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. Commendation for saving his unit during an enemy attack. This is the man you shot for visiting his sister. Blake stared at the records, feeling the full weight of what he had done. He had convinced himself that David was a criminal, but the evidence showed he was exactly the opposite, a decorated hero who had risked his life for his country. The body camera footage tells the real story, Prosecutor Park said, activating. Another screen. Let's watch it together. Blake was forced to watch his own actions from that night. Seeing it objectively, without the adrenaline and fear clouding his judgment, he could see clearly what had really happened. David had been polite, cooperative, and non-threatening throughout the entire encounter. Where do you see the threatening behavior in this video? Agent Chun asked. Blake couldn't answer. There was no threatening behavior to point to. David had done everything right, and Blake had shot him anyway. Your own body camera proves that you violated Sergeant Thompson's civil rights, Prosecutor Park said firmly. There's no ambiguity here. Agent Chun leaned forward. Mr. Blake, we know you altered your statement with Captain Martinez's help. We have evidence of the conspiracy to cover up what really happened. Blake's lawyer finally spoke up. I need to consult with my client privately. Of course, Agent Chun said. But Mr. Blake, I want you to understand something. The federal government is prepared to prosecute this case to the fullest extent of the law. Your cooperation could make a difference in your sentencing. After the federal agents left the room, Blake's lawyer was blunt about the situation. Ryan, the evidence against you is overwhelming. The video footage, the recorded conversations, your history of complaints, it's all going to come out at trial. Blake put his head in his hands. I thought I was doing my job. I thought he was a threat. The jury isn't going to see it that way, Wright said honestly. A decorated war hero was shot while visiting his sister. The optics are terrible. Blake realized that his prejudices and fears had destroyed not only David's life, but his own life as well. What are my options? We could try to negotiate a plea agreement. Admit guilt in exchange for a reduced sentence. Otherwise, you're looking at potentially decades in federal prison. Meanwhile, news of Blake's interrogation was spreading. The federal government had leaked enough details to the media to show the strength of their case. Headlines across the country emphasized the revelation that David was a decorated combat veteran carrying classified documents. At the hospital, David was recovering enough to follow the news coverage. His sister Lisa read him updates from her phone. Blake had no idea who you really were, she said. He shot a war hero and thought he was arresting a criminal. David felt a mix of sadness and anger. Lisa, he didn't shoot me because of what was in my jacket. He shot me because of what he saw when he looked at my face. Colonel Harris visited again that afternoon with more updates from the Pentagon. Sergeant, the military investigation has uncovered evidence of systemic problems in that police department. Your case is going to lead to major reforms. David nodded weakly. Sir, I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. It won't, Colonel Harris promised. The federal government is going to make an example of this case. Every police department in the country is going to see what happens when they violate the civil rights of military personnel. Back at the detention center, Blake was coming to terms with his situation. The evidence was overwhelming, the charges were serious, and the federal government was determined to prosecute him aggressively. His wife Jennifer visited that evening, crying as she saw him in federal custody. Ryan, how did it come to this? Blake struggled to explain. I made a terrible mistake, honey. I let my fears and assumptions control my actions. The news is saying you shot a war hero, Jennifer said through her tears. Blake nodded sadly. I did, and now I have to face the consequences. The federal case was sending shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. Police officers everywhere were watching to see how quickly and decisively the federal government would act. When civil rights were violated, Blake's arrest had become a symbol of accountability and justice. The speed of federal intervention showed that some victims had powerful protectors who wouldn't allow injustice to stand. For Blake, the revelation of David's true identity and status made his actions seem even more inexcusable. He had shot an American hero based on prejudice and fear, and now he would face the full consequences of that choice. The federal courthouse was packed beyond capacity on the first day of the trial. Media crews from around the world had descended on the small city to cover what had become a symbol of the fight for civil rights and military honor. Security was unprecedented, with federal marshals screening everyone who entered the building. Judge Patricia Williams gavelled the court to order as she looked out over the crowded courtroom. In the gallery sat David's family, military officers in dress uniforms, civil rights leaders, and dozens of reporters. The weight of national attention was palpable. The United States of America versus Ryan Blake and Captain Martinez, the clerk announced. The defendants are charged with violation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Federal prosecutor Lisa Park stood to address the jury during opening statements. She was a veteran prosecutor who had handled dozens of civil rights cases, but this one felt different. The evidence was so clear, the injustice so obvious, that she felt the weight of history on her shoulders. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, this case is about a decorated American hero who was shot down in the street for the crime of visiting his sister while black. The defense attorney, Thomas Wright, had taken on an almost impossible case. He knew the evidence was overwhelming, but his job was to create reasonable doubt where none seemed to exist. "Ladies and gentlemen," he countered, "this case is about a police officer who made a split-second decision based on his training and experience. Officer Blake believed he was in danger, and he acted to protect himself. But Prosecutor Park had evidence that made such arguments difficult to sustain." She began with the body camera footage, playing it for the jury on large screens throughout the courtroom. The jury watched in silence as David politely answered Blake's questions, showed his identification, and remained calm throughout the escalating encounter. They saw him raise his hands when ordered and heard him repeatedly state that he was not a threat. "You can see for yourselves," Park told the jury, "that Sergeant Thompson did everything right. He was polite, cooperative, and non-threatening. He followed every command and posed no danger to anyone." When it came time for witness testimony, Mrs. Rodriguez took the stand as the prosecution's first witness. Her voice shook with emotion as she described what she had seen from her porch that night. "I've known David Thompson for years," she testified. "He's a good young man who has always been respectful and kind. I watched him get shot for no reason at all." Under cross-examination, Wright tried to suggest that Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't see clearly from her porch, but her testimony was supported by her cell phone video and the accounts of other neighbors. The most powerful moment came when David himself took the stand. He entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, still recovering from his injuries. The bronze star on his dress uniform caught the light as he was sworn in. "Sergeant Thompson," Prosecutor Park began gently, "can you tell the jury about your military service?" David's voice was steady despite his physical weakness. "I served 3 tours of duty in combat zones. I was decorated for actions under fire where I helped save members of my unit." Park introduced David's military records into evidence, showing his decorations for valor and his spotless service record. The jury saw photographs of David in uniform, receiving awards from high-ranking military officers. "On the night you were shot, what were you doing?" "I was visiting my sister, ma'am. I had just returned from deployment and wanted to see my family." David described the traffic stop in detail, explaining how he had tried to remain calm and cooperative despite Blake's increasingly hostile behavior. "At any point did you threaten Officer Blake or make any aggressive moves?" "No, ma'am. I kept my hands visible at all times and tried to de-escalate the situation. My military training taught me to stay calm under pressure." Wright's cross-examination was difficult to watch. He tried to suggest that David's movements might have appeared threatening to Blake, but David's calm responses undermined every argument. "Sergeant Thompson, you reached toward your jacket pocket, didn't you?" "Yes, sir, but only after the officer asked for additional identification. I moved slowly and told him exactly what I was doing." "Could that movement have been interpreted as threatening?" David looked directly at Blake, who was sitting at the defense table with his head down. "Sir, I've been in real combat situations where people actually wanted to kill me. I know what a real threat looks like. I was not threatening anyone that night." The testimony that shocked everyone came from Colonel Harris, David's commanding officer. Prosecutor Park had called him to establish David's character and military service. "Colonel, can you describe Sergeant Thompson's service record?" "Sergeant Thompson is one of the finest soldiers I've ever commanded. He has shown exceptional courage under fire and has saved American lives in combat." But then Colonel Harris revealed something that hadn't been made public before. "Your Honor, I want the court to know that Sergeant Thompson was being considered for promotion to officer candidate school. His shooting may have ended a promising military career." The impact on the jury was visible. Here was a young man whose service to his country had been cut short by a police officer's prejudice and fear. General Washington herself took the stand to describe the military's response to the shooting. Her presence in the courtroom was unprecedented and showed how seriously the Pentagon took attacks on military personnel. "General, how did the military view this incident?" Park asked. "We viewed it as an attack on one of our own," General Washington replied firmly. "Sergeant Thompson was shot while carrying out a routine family visit. The idea that our soldiers aren't safe in their own communities is unacceptable." The defense had few witnesses and little evidence to present, Blake himself chose not to testify. On advice of his lawyer, Captain Martinez testified but only succeeded in confirming the prosecution's case about the attempted cover-up. The most damaging evidence came from the recorded conversations between Blake and Martinez after the shooting. The jury heard them discussing how to make Blake's actions appear justified. "We need to emphasize that he was acting suspiciously," Martinez's voice said on the recording. "Yeah, and that he didn't comply with my commands," Blake responded, but the body camera footage directly contradicted these claims, making it clear that they were fabricating a false narrative during closing arguments. Prosecutor Parks summarized the case simply: the defendants violated Sergeant Thompson's civil rights and then tried to cover it up. The evidence is clear, and justice demands accountability. Wright made one final attempt to create doubt. Officer Blake made a mistake, but it was an honest mistake based on his perception of threat. Prosecutor Parks' rebuttal was devastating. There was no threat, and the defendants knew it. That's why they tried to cover it up instead of standing by their actions? The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning with their verdict. The foreman stood and read the decision that would resonate across the country. "We find the defendant, Ryan Blake, guilty on all counts. We find the defendant, Captain Martinez, guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted in cheers from David's supporters and civil rights advocates. Blake's wife broke down in tears as the reality of the verdict sank in. Judge Williams scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the message was already clear. The federal government had successfully prosecuted police officers for violating the civil rights of a military service member. Outside the courthouse, David spoke to reporters from his wheelchair. "I hope this verdict sends a message that no one is above the law, and that all Americans deserve equal protection regardless of the color of their skin." The trial had become more than just a criminal case. It had become a symbol of accountability, justice, and the principle that civil rights must be protected by the full force of federal law. For Blake and Martinez, the guilty verdicts meant their lives would never be the same. For David and his family, it meant that justice had finally been served. The sentencing hearing was held 6 weeks after the verdict, and the courthouse was once again filled to capacity. Judge Williams had spent considerable time reviewing the evidence, the defendants' backgrounds, and the impact statements from David and his family before making her decision. Blake sat at the defense table, looking older than his years. The stress of the trial and the reality of his situation had taken a visible toll. His wife Jennifer sat in the gallery behind him, her eyes red from crying. Captain Martinez appeared equally defeated. His 20-year career in law enforcement was over, his pension was gone, and his reputation was destroyed. The conspiracy charges had proven that he was not just a supervisor who made a mistake, but an active participant in covering up civil rights violations. Judge Williams called the court to order and addressed the packed courtroom. "This case has captured national attention because it represents fundamental questions about justice, civil rights, and accountability in our society." She turned to Blake first. "Mr. Blake, you have been convicted of violating the civil rights of a decorated American veteran under color of law. Your actions on that night were not just a mistake, they were a crime that has had devastating consequences." The judge reviewed Blake's history of complaints and misconduct, painting a picture of an officer who had repeatedly abused his authority. The evidence shows a pattern of behavior that culminated in the near-fatal shooting of an innocent man. Sergeant Thompson was guilty of nothing more than visiting his sister while black. Blake's lawyer had argued for leniency, citing Blake's family and his years of service, but Judge Williams was unmoved. "Mr. Blake, I sentence you to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release." Jennifer Blake collapsed in sobs as the reality of the sentence hit her. 18 years meant her husband would be in prison until their children were adults. Martinez received a lighter but still significant sentence. "Captain Martinez, your actions in trying to cover up this crime were almost as serious as the original shooting. You betrayed your oath as a police officer and your duty to seek justice. I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison and 2 years of supervised release." Both men would also be required to pay restitution to David for his medical expenses and lost wages, though no amount of money could truly compensate for what they had taken from him. After the sentencing, David spoke to the media outside the courthouse. He was still in a wheelchair but had regained much of his strength and voice. Today's sentences send a clear message that police officers who violate civil rights will be held accountable, he said. But this case was never just about me. It was about ensuring that all Americans receive equal protection under the law. The impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. Within weeks of the trial, Congress passed the Military Personnel Protection Act, which created specific federal penalties for civil rights violations. Against military service members, General Washington announced new protocols at a Pentagon press conference. From now on, any incident involving the mistreatment of military personnel by civilian law enforcement will trigger immediate federal investigation. We will not wait for local authorities to act. The Justice Department also announced new guidelines for federal intervention in civil rights cases. Attorney General Collins explained the policy change. This case has shown that swift federal action can ensure justice when local systems fail. We will not hesitate to use federal authority to protect constitutional rights. But perhaps the most significant changes came at the local level. The Oak Ridge Police Department was placed under federal oversight with court-appointed monitors, ensuring that reforms were implemented and maintained. Chief Roberts, who had replaced the departed chief, announced sweeping changes to department policies. We are implementing new training on de-escalation, bias recognition, and constitutional policing. Every officer will receive extensive retraining. The department also instituted new accountability measures, including independent investigations of all use-of-force incidents and civilian oversight of disciplinary actions. David's personal journey became an inspiration to many. Despite his physical disabilities from the shooting, he enrolled in law school with the goal of becoming a civil rights attorney. I want to use my experience to help other victims of police violence, he explained in an interview. If something positive can come from what happened to me, I want it to be that others get the justice they deserve. His sister Lisa had also become an advocate, working with families of police violence victims to navigate the legal system and find support. David's case was unusual because he had the military backing him up, she said. Most families don't have that kind of support, and we want to help level the playing field. The case had also sparked broader conversations about race and policing. Across the country, police departments nationwide began reviewing their policies and training procedures, fearing that they too might face federal intervention if civil rights violations occurred. Community leaders praised the federal response, while acknowledging that more work remained to be done. This case shows what's possible when the federal government takes civil rights seriously, said Reverend Johnson, who had organized the early protests. But we need this kind of swift action to be the norm, not the exception. A year after the shooting, David was honored at a ceremony at the Pentagon. General Washington presented him with a special recognition award for his courage and dignity throughout the ordeal. Sergeant Thompson has shown the same courage in facing injustice that he showed in combat, General Washington said. He has made our military and our nation proud. David's recovery was ongoing but remarkable. While he would never fully regain all his physical abilities, his spirit remained unbroken. He had become a symbol of resilience and hope for many people facing their own struggles with injustice. The changes sparked by his case were being felt across the country. Police departments were implementing new training, federal prosecutors were more aggressive in pursuing civil rights cases, and military personnel knew they had powerful protectors if their rights were violated. Blake and Martinez began serving their sentences in federal prison, where they would have years to contemplate the consequences of their actions. Their cases became cautionary tales, taught in police academies across the nation. The quiet neighborhood where it all began had returned to normal, but the residents would never forget what they had witnessed. Mrs. Rodriguez still lived across from Lisa's house, and she often thought about how a few minutes of cell phone video had helped bring justice to a decorated hero. David's story had become proof that the system could work when good people refused to stay silent and when federal authorities used their power to protect civil rights. It was a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still prevail when citizens demanded it and institutions responded with courage and determination. The case had changed lives, reformed institutions, and renewed faith in the possibility that America could live up to its highest ideals of equality and justice for all. It was a victory not just for David Thompson, but for everyone who believed that civil rights were worth fighting for.